Podcorn is a marketplace connecting podcasters to amazing podcast sponsorship opportunities, such as host-read ads, interview segments, topical discussions, and more. With Podcorn, there is no middleman. Podcasters of all sizes can browse and choose opportunities right on the platform, set their own rates, and collaborate with brands directly, without any exclusivities. You scroll through the many advertisers, send them a message, and tell them why your podcast would be a great place for their advertisement. This marketplace gives podcasters creative freedom and full control of how and when they monetize. Podcorn will support you at every step of the way to ensure you're protected and compensated for the work that you do for brands. Explore sponsorship opportunities and start monetizing your podcast by clicking the link in my show notes to sign up for Podcorn. Go to podcorn.com to get signed up today.
This podcast contains adult themes and graphic violence. Listener discretion is advised.
A commercial-free version of this podcast is available on Patreon for $1 per month. Patreon.com/Beyond Contempt podcast. I'm Renee, and this is Beyond Contempt True Crime. This is a case I haven't heard of until recently, even though it was one of the biggest events that happened in Wichita, Kansas history. Wichita is a pretty large place at 650,000, with both city and surrounding areas, yet it retains that small-town feel. Neighbors know each other, and door locking seems optional. The most frightening thing about this case was the randomness of the crimes. You're listening to Episode 21, The Wichita Massacre. Reginald Carr Sr. and Janice Harding had their first child, Tamika, in 1974 when they were just teenagers themselves. They sent Tamika to live with Reginald's mother for the first year of her life. The couple married and had 3 more children. Reginald Jr. was born in 1977, Regina was born in 1979, and Jonathan arrived in 1980. All the Carr children had been preterm, arriving prior to their due dates. Just as the family celebrated Jonathan's first birthday, doctors diagnosed Regina with leukemia. The rift between Janice and her mother-in-law started around that time. Grandma noticed bruising on Regina's legs and called Child Protective Services on her daughter-in-law. Janice claimed that the bruising resulted from having to hold Regina down when they administered chemotherapy. Unfortunately, cancer treatments were not enough, and Regina passed away prior to her 3rd birthday. The Carr brothers had opposite reactions in response to their sister's death. Jonathan possessed a normal reaction and wept over the loss of Regina. Reggie lacked a reaction and detached emotionally from life. As he grew older, it was clear that he lacked empathy for other individuals. The family who once attended church together was now plagued by alcoholism, increased violence, and neglect. Later, Tamika testified that her father beat her mother with a stick. Janice disciplined her children by spanking with spoons, belts, shoes, and even extension cords. She named the belts she used to whip her children with, and even called one Heat Daddy. Janice forced the children to pick the belt that they wanted to be spanked with. She made the child lie on the ground in their underwear, while the other children held down the legs and arms. If the child tried to get up, there would be more lashings. The marriage declined rapidly, and Reginald Sr. moved to California and was no longer a part of his children's lives. Janice started disappearing for several days at a time. Reginald Jr. and Jonathan were not looked after and filled their time without parental oversight. This cemented their close relationship. The Carr brothers took advantage of their lack of supervision and began drinking and having sex while still attending elementary school. At age 6, Reginald fondled little girls in his mother's care, and at age 7, he was having sex with his 7-year-old female cousin. At age 7, Jonathan was so unhappy that he attempted suicide by hanging himself. Janice was seeing a new man, named Rick Austin. She would ignore her children and stay holed up in her bedroom doing drugs with her new love interest. At dinner time, she cooked, loaded her plate up, and closed the door on the way into the bedroom. The young children had to fend for themselves and never received much attention or affection from their mother. Janice eventually married Rick. He was more than rough around the edges. Rick turned out to be a violent man and even beat Janice with a gun one time. Tamika believed that he made his living stealing cars and selling the parts. The Carrs moved to Dodge City, Kansas, around the time the boys were middle school age. Reginald was a poor student who got into fights. At age 13, he was already a gang member and dealt drugs. The school suspended Reginald for sexually harassing a teacher during his 8th grade school year. Even though the Carr brothers were close, they did not play like typical children. The brothers shot BBs at each other when they couldn't find animals to target, and as a result, Reginald has a BB pellet permanently lodged in his skull. Janice acknowledged she couldn't control her sons, so she sent them to live with a family friend. At age 15, Reginald dropped out of school before the principal could kick him out. He eventually completed his GED. He moved out of the family friend's home and couch surfed at various friends' places. At age 16, Reginald fathered his first child. Not long after, Reginald accumulated his first felony when he robbed a bookstore. The courts were lenient, and he only received probation time. Reginald didn't stay out of trouble for long and was arrested for drugs, theft, aggravated assault, and obstruction of legal process. The state sent him to prison this time. Reginald had a second child with a different girlfriend when he was behind bars. They married in 1997. Reginald's incarceration partially fed his brother's depression, and Jonathan attempted suicide again by drinking antifreeze. His life was spared when he was rushed to the hospital, where his stomach was pumped. Reginald was released from jail in the spring of 2000. In fall of that year, the brothers went out to a Dodge City nightclub where Reginald met a nurse who was from Wichita. Not only was he attracted to her appearance, he was just as attracted to her money. The Carr brothers were drawn to the promise of perceived wealth that Wichita held and knew that was where they had to be. Reginald and Jonathan Carr moved to Wichita right after they illegally secured handguns. 23-year-old Andrew Schreiber was a former Wichita State baseball player. He landed his dream job as the assistant coach for his alma mater's baseball team. He was a large, athletic man, not prone to being intimidated by others. Andrew was unaware that his 1998 Ford Expedition SUV attracted 22-year-old Reginald Carr and 20-year-old Jonathan Carr. At 10:45 p.m. on December 7, 2000, Andrew stopped at the Come and Go convenience store to buy a Skol and a few other items. He paid for his purchases and got back into his car. It was winter in Kansas, and on that particular night, the below-freezing temperature created a definitive lack of witnesses for the carjacking that unfolded. Reginald Carr placed the barrel of his gun on Andrew Schreiber's window and forced his way into the SUV. As Andrew moved over into the passenger seat, he was pistol-whipped for not moving fast enough. It was apparent to Andrew that this person was in charge. Reginald drove to an alley and parked. Jonathan pulled up behind them, walked up to the SUV, and moved Andrew into the back seat. Jonathan pistol-whipped Andrew to remind him to keep his eyes to himself. They drove to several ATMs, where Reginald forced Andrew to make $300 withdrawals at each one until the money ran out. Reginald dropped Jonathan back off at his car, and the brothers drove both vehicles out onto a field. After they debated what steps to take next, Reginald ordered Andrew to his knees. Shots rang out, and Andrew felt relieved when he realized that the tires on his SUV were blown out, and he was still alive. The Carr brothers left him in the field and drove away. 55-year-old Anne Walenta graduated from Wichita State University with a bachelor degree in instrumental music education in 1968. She followed that up with a master's degree in music theory and composition in 1972. Anne taught music in the Texas and Oklahoma public school systems. She returned to Kansas and taught cello at Friends University and also gave private lessons. Anne was an orchestral librarian with job duties that included ordering and tracking music. She loved classical music and spent her evenings playing cello in the Wichita Symphony. Anne also played in the Oklahoma, Texas, and New York symphonies in the past. She was a mother with 2 grown daughters, and on December 11th at 9:40 p.m., did not fathom she would be followed home by reckless criminals like the Carr brothers. Anne pulled her 2000 GMC Yukon into her driveway after a symphony rehearsal. A man approached her car, exclaiming he needed help, and when she rolled down her window, Reginald Carr pointed a gun at her face. Anne was so flustered that she tried to start her already running car, causing the starter to grind. Anne shifted into reverse and was shot 3 times. One of those bullets severed her spine. Anne was able to press the horn, prompting her neighbor across the street to dial 911. The Carr brothers fled the scene, and Anne was taken to the hospital where she gave police a description of Reginald Carr. On the evening of December 14th, 2000, the Carr brothers sought out another target. A woman with an SUV pulled out from what the Carr brothers perceived as an extravagant restaurant, so they followed her. Reginald and Jonathan were not the most discerning criminal minds, and they didn't take measures to conceal their presence as they closely trailed the SUV. The woman realized that she was being followed, called her daughter, and had her open the garage door. When the woman arrived home with the Carr brothers in tow, she drove straight into the garage and immediately pressed the clicker to close the door. The brothers sat outside the triplex condo, not knowing which door led to the woman from the SUV. Instead of calling everything off, they picked the middle door and decided they were going in. What was lucky for the woman in the SUV was not so lucky for the 5 individuals who were next door. "26-year-old Jason Beffort, 27-year-old Brad Heika, and 29-year-old Aaron Sander were roommates who all found jobs in Wichita after college. 25-year-old Heather Muller had a close relationship with Aaron. A 25-year-old woman called HG in court documents dated Jason. HG also brought her dog to the condo because she was spending the night. Aaron and Heather hung out watching TV. Brad was downstairs in his room. Jason and HG retired to bed early. HG pulled her hair back and put in her barrette before she cozied herself under the covers. That coziness was short-lived when the Carr brothers forced their way into the condo bearing guns. They immediately had Aaron and Heather on the ground. Reginald demanded to know who else was in the home and was informed that 2 more individuals were upstairs. He dragged Jason and HG downstairs, and Brad was hauled upstairs from the basement. With everyone corralled, they were told to lay face down on the ground. Reginald demanded to know where the safe was because in his mind, all rich people owned a safe. HG's dog was barking in distress. One brother threatened to shoot the dog if someone didn't shut it up. HG found the muzzle and put it on her dog. The brothers made their victims strip naked and put them in a closet while they searched the condo for valuables. Jonathan found a diamond ring hidden in a container. Instead of a romantic proposal, HG found out about Jason's engagement plans while she was being held captive. The brothers turned their attention to the hostages, and that is when the sexual assaults began. They wanted the women with the women with themselves, and the men with the women. When some men resisted or couldn't perform on command, they were hit with a golf club. All the specific details can be found in court documents, easily searchable online. Next, Reginald wanted all their ATM cards. He took each victim one at a time in Jason's truck and drained all their bank accounts. Jonathan stayed behind to watch over everyone. He raped and sodomized the women. When Reginald returned, he took part as well. After enduring hours of the worst night of their lives, Reginald informed everyone that it was time to go. He allowed the women to put sweaters on. The men remained naked. The Carr brothers tried to fit all 5 victims into the trunk of Aaron's Honda Civic, but they didn't fit, so HG and Reginald got into Jason's truck. The red glow of the interior clock informed HG that it was 2:07 a.m. Aaron, Brad, and Jason were directed to ride in the trunk of the car, while Heather rode in the back seat with Jonathan driving. Both cars drove to a soccer field. The location was remote, with not much nearby. They ordered everyone out of the cars in freezing temperatures. Reginald had Aaron, Heather, Brad, Jason, and HG get down on their knees. He shot them execution style, one by one in the back of their heads. With 5 bodies on the ground, Reginald got back into Jason's truck and drove over everyone to ensure they were dead. Jonathan got back in Aaron's car and followed his brother back to the Birchwood Drive triplex to finish ransacking it. At 3 a.m., they finished loading up Jason's truck with possessions and drove home. The Carr brothers didn't realize that despite their best efforts to kill all the witnesses, someone survived. HG saw stars and felt the impact of the bullet, but remained conscious during the whole event. She remained kneeling after the gun was fired, but was kicked from behind and fell to the ground. The beret she had put on at bedtime spared her life when the bullet deflected off the cheap plastic product. HG laid on the ground and played dead until the Carr brothers drove away. When she got up to check her friends, Brad, Aaron, and Heather were deceased. Jason was still breathing, but there was blood everywhere. She took off her sweater and wrapped it around his head. HG ran naked and bleeding through sub-20-degree temperatures to find help. She traveled over a mile in her bare feet and even climbed over a barbed wire fence that cut her up considerably. HG arrived at the first home she stumbled across, where the couple took her in and dialed 911. The husband tried to relay HG's story to the dispatcher, but HG thought she was going to die and took the phone to tell her story. When paramedics and police arrived, HG gave him the description of the Carr brothers and of Jason's truck. Police arrived at the soccer field at 2:54 a.m. It was too late for Jason. All 4 victims were deceased. Months after the crime, a .380 caliber handgun was found near the soccer field. The Kansas State Crime Lab confirmed it was the weapon used on Mrs. Walenta and the other 5 victims. When the authorities arrived at the Birchwood Drive triplex, the place was ransacked, and HG's dog was lying on her bed in a pool of blood. That was the Carr brothers' final act of depravity. We're going to take a quick break to hear from our sponsor. As all of you know, podcasting about true crime is sort of my thing. But even I need an occasional break, and my go-to game is Best Fiends. Best Fiends is a puzzle game that you can play on your phone, and it's really neat because you can go through all these levels, solving challenging puzzles that actually engage your brain, but it's a casual game that anyone can play. The great thing about it is that it doesn't take up much of your time, but it's great in that it fills up those moments where you wish you had something to do, aside from scrolling through Facebook over and over again. You also don't need an internet connection to play it, so it's convenient for you when you don't have any connection, like on an airplane. Engage your brain with fun puzzles and collect tons of cute characters. Trust me, with over 100 million downloads, this 5-star rated mobile puzzle game is a must-play. Download Best Fiends, free on the Apple App Store or Google Play. That's friends without the R. Best Fiends. Now, back to the show. In the light of the next day, Reginald unloaded Jason's truck, unaware that a neighbor was watching him. The Birchwood Drive murders were plastered all over the news, along with a description of Jason's truck. The neighbor watching Reginald recognized the truck and called the police. Reginald was inside his girlfriend's apartment when he heard the police sirens. He tried to escape out of a patio window, but was captured by police. Reginald possessed $996 in cash, with 49 $20 bills, a gas card with Jason's name, and Heather's watch. Inside the apartment, police found Brad's TV, Jason's checkbook, Brad's wallet, Andrew Schreiber's guest watch, HG's credit card, and Aaron's garment bag with his name and address tag still attached. Plus, there were all kinds of tools, clothing, and jewelry. Inside the Dodge Dakota pickup truck was Jason's driver's license, wallet, ATM card, and receipts from the cash withdrawals. Jonathan was at his girlfriend's mother's home. She had been watching the TV coverage about the murders as well, and became immediately suspicious. She checked Jonathan's pockets and found a large amount of cash and a ring. He had only dated her daughter for about a week, so she knew that the ring wasn't for a proposal. She went to a payphone and called the police. Jonathan ran out of the apartment door, but he didn't make it more than a few blocks before he was tackled and arrested. Police recovered Jason's engagement ring and $1,000 in cash. Andrew Schreiber was able to identify Reginald Carr, but not Jonathan. Anne Walenta identified Reginald as the shooter, but could not correctly identify Jonathan. She was left paralyzed from the waist down from the shooting. Anne was scheduled to be transferred to a rehabilitation facility, but succumbed to her injuries on January 2, 2001. She died from a pulmonary embolism, which was a complication from her spinal injury. Her husband Don and children established a scholarship in her name to honor her legacy. Mary Dudley was a chief medical examiner for the Sedgwick County Regional Forensic Science Center and testified at the Carr brothers' trial. She determined that all the victims died of gunshot wounds to the head. Some victims had bruising and red ridges from blunt force trauma, which was consistent with receiving blows from a golf club. The shooter stood closest to Aaron and Heather, with the gun barrel butted up to the back of their necks when he pulled the trigger. Brad and Jason were shot from a greater distance away. Brad Haka died of a gunshot wound to the head with separate cranial injuries that showed blunt force trauma to the neck and head. Aaron Sander died of a contact gunshot wound to the head with separate abrasions to his forehead, possibly from being hit with the gun. He also had bruising on his legs. Heather Muller died of a gunshot wound to the back of the head. A forensic nurse also described lacerations and bruising consistent with rape. Jason Beffert died of a gunshot wound to the back of the head with a bullet exiting below his eye. He had injuries on his buttocks, legs, and toes, consistent with receiving blows from a golf club. HG's dog died from being beaten to death, possibly with a golf club, and then was stabbed through the neck with something like an ice pick. HG survived the ordeal, but suffered a fracture to her skull. The barrette kept the bullet from entering her brain. She had other bruising, cuts, scratches, and suffered from frostbite to her feet. Brad Haka was raised in Dodge City, Kansas. He played on the Garden City Community College golf team from 1991 to 1993. Brad graduated with a finance degree from Kansas State University and worked at the Koch Petroleum Group. He was known for his infectious personality and was the hub that brought different branches of his friends together. Not much could be found out about Aaron Sander, who had recently quit his Koch Petroleum job and planned on becoming a priest. More is known about his ex-girlfriend and close friend, Heather Muller, who was a Wichita State University student. She loved children and wanted to help special needs kids. In high school, she was involved in music theater for young people, Wichita Children's Theater, and the Music Theater of Wichita. In 1998, Heather graduated with a degree in audiology from Wichita State University. She began working with children as a church preschool teacher while pursuing her master's degree in early childhood special education. Heather would have completed her degree in May 2001. Jason Beffert was a former football star, worked as a science teacher, and coached JV basketball. His girlfriend HG was an elementary school teacher and was the sole survivor of this massacre. Nikki was HG Schnauzer and was a beloved and cherished canine. These murders were shattering to the city of Wichita. Security systems and gun sales increased. It upset many people that the Carr brothers were not charged with a hate crime, since they were black and all the victims were white. The racial tensions increased in the city, and a resident even hung an effigy of the Carr brothers in his front yard. The prosecution decided that the attacks were not race-related and appeared to be random. For the Carr brothers, the crime seemed to be driven by money, and their perception that the victims were wealthy. Because of the heinous nature of the crimes, the state sought the death penalty against both men. The trial started on October 22, 2002. The Carr brothers were facing 113 counts of murder, rape, sodomy, kidnapping, burglary, robbery, and larceny. Reginald and Jonathan were tried together, and there was a mountain of evidence against them. The prosecution presented 90 witnesses and 800 pieces of evidence, including DNA. In the Birchwood Drive condo, Jonathan Carr's semen was collected from the dining room, and they recovered his hair from Jason's bathroom. Police collected his semen from HG's rape kit, and a stain on his boxers matched Heather's DNA. They also found Heather's DNA on Reginald's undershorts. A ballistics expert determined the gun used to kill the Birchwood Drive victims was the same gun used to murder Anne Walenta and shoot out the tires of Andrew Schreiber's car. Since they recovered the gun from the soccer field, the ballistics expert could not directly tie the gun to either Carr brother. HG's testimony was the important glue that linked the events of that night with the physical evidence. Not only was she able to identify both perpetrators and take the jury through what happened on that awful night, she also contracted a sexually transmitted infection that tied Reginald to the crime. Months after the attack, HG came down with an STI called the human papillomavirus. Reginald's former nurse girlfriend, Stephanie Donnelly, said that Reginald Carr had HPV. She noticed the condition after they met at the Dodge City nightclub in October 2000 and started seeing one another. Stephanie testified for the prosecution and explained that both brothers were unemployed, yet carried large amounts of cash in December 2000. Reginald lied and said he'd won the money fighting his pit bull. Her testimony was also important because she connected all the stolen merchandise to Reginald when she witnessed him carrying several items into her home. There was no real strategy used by the defense. The Carr brothers did not testify at the trial. In their summations, the defense attorneys for each Carr brother pointed fingers at the other. Reginald's lawyer pointed out issues and inconsistencies with witness identification and stressed that the DNA at the Birchwood Drive crime scene belonged to Jonathan. Jonathan's lawyer was quick to point out that Anne Walenta and Andrew Schreiber identified Reginald and not Jonathan. And Reginald had most of the stolen belongings in his possession at the time of his arrest. They convicted Reginald of 1 count of kidnapping, aggravated robbery, aggravated battery, and criminal damage to property for the Schreiber carjacking, 1 count of first-degree felony murder for the Walenta shooting, and 3 counts of unlawful possession of a firearm. Jonathan was acquitted of all counts related to the Schreiber carjacking, but was convicted of first-degree felony murder for the Walenta shooting. For the Birchwood Drive murders, both brothers were convicted of 1 count of attempted first-degree murder, 5 counts of aggravated kidnapping, 9 counts of aggravated robbery, 20 counts of rape or attempted rape, 3 counts of aggravated criminal sodomy, 1 count of aggravated burglary, and 1 count of theft. And even Nikki the Schnauzer got her day in court, when they were each convicted of 1 count of cruelty to animals. When it came time to debate capital punishment, and if it applied to these crimes, Reginald and Jonathan's family begged for their lives to be spared. Reginald Carr married a woman named Mandy in 1997, who was the mother of his second son, and she also gave birth to their daughter 4 months after his arrest for the murders. Reginald had an older son from a previous relationship with a woman named Rochelle Kosman. Both of the mothers to his children begged the court for leniency. Janice Harding, the Carr brothers' mother, could not attend most of the trial because of her job responsibilities, but she attended the sentencing. She was there to ask the court to spare the lives of her sons. Janice called what they did a horrible mistake and didn't know if she was to blame. She said if it was something she caused, she was sorry. Andrew and HG spoke at the sentencing, and their words carried a lot of weight with the jury. Andrew Schreiber said he had constant reminders of his ordeal because he still lived in Wichita, and he had survivor's guilt. HG said her life was damaged and forever changed. She had nightmares and woke up in sweats. Small noises unnerved her when she was home. She had to cover up the bald spot on her head, where hair no longer sprouted after being shot. HG had scars on her knees from the carpet burns she received during the rapes. After 7 hours of deliberation, the jury felt that the state proved its case beyond a reasonable doubt and delivered 4 separate verdicts of death for each brother for the murders of Jason, Brad, Aaron, and Heather. When the Carr brothers were convicted and sentenced, they showed little emotion. The mayor gave a soundbite to the media. He said that he was not a proponent of capital punishment, but because of the heinous nature of the crimes, the outcome was fitting. The families of the victims sued the state of Kansas, alleging everyone would still be alive had they done their job correctly. Reginald got out of prison in spring of 2000. He received a DUI on November 19, 2000, but posted bail that same day. A few days later, a warrant was issued because the DUI violated his parole agreement, and he was arrested. Then, his parole officer mistakenly calculated that his parole expired on December 1st, and subsequently withdrew the parole violation warrant. The mistake was substantial because Reginald's parole was supposed to have continued until June 1st, 2001. Reginald was also being held in jail on forgery charges, but he posted bail on December 5th, 2000. 2 days later, he kicked off the crime spree and carjacked Andrew Schreiber. After 6 months, the state settled and paid out $1.7 million to the relatives of the victims. In 1972, the Supreme Court struck down the death penalty in Kansas, but they signed it back into law in 1994. The Carr brothers were sentenced to death in November 2002. In December 2004, the Kansas Supreme Court ruled that the death penalty was unconstitutional. 2 years later, in 2006, they decided that the death penalty statute was consistent with the Constitution. Kansas has been battling over the legitimacy of the death penalty for several decades, which is likely why they haven't executed an inmate since 1965, and why there wasn't any forward movement with the Carr brothers' death sentence. In 2014, it was a devastating blow to the victims and the victims' families when the Kansas Supreme Court vacated the Carr brothers' death penalty sentences because they believed that Eighth Amendment rights were violated. They felt that the judge's instructions did not provide enough information for the jury to understand how to weigh the mitigating factors against the aggravating factors. As in, how does the jury consider a defendant's terrible childhood or defendant's brain injury versus the crimes they committed for death penalty cases? The defense also argued that the jury was prejudiced by certain facts that would never have been introduced had they been tried separately. In 2016, the federal Supreme Court ruled that the Kansas Supreme Court was incorrect in overturning the death sentences for Reginald and Jonathan Carr. The court examined if the jury received adequate instructions for weighing all the factors. Justice Scalia said that jurors will offer mercy when they think it's appropriate, and sentence defendants to death when it's deserved. That was how the law was intended to work. Scalia did not agree that separate trials would have led to a different outcome for the Carr brothers. In November 2019, a group of death row inmates tried to argue that they cannot legally be executed by the state due to the Kansas State Supreme Court's ruling on abortion. It was determined that a woman can make her own decisions about her body. Therefore, attorneys argued that individuals on death row should have the same rights of personal autonomy over their own body. A ruling for that case has not yet been announced, and the Carr brothers remain on death row. There were very few silver linings in this grievous Wichita Massacre case, but one happy connection grew from it. H.G. and Andrew Schreiber met and got to know one another because of the trial. They married in 2004 and have children. Thank you so much for joining me for this episode of Beyond Contempt. Please visit beyondcontemptpodcast.com for the links to the sources used in this episode. This episode was researched by Laura Delgado. Script writing, editing, and all audio production were performed by me. If you like the show, please leave me a favorable review on Apple Podcasts. And I know that it feels like the world is falling apart around us, but try to take care of yourself. Listen to your favorite podcasts, try to watch the movies that you've always wanted to see but never had the time, and read a few new books. All we can do is take life one day at a time. Before I sign off, I want to introduce you to the ladies from a podcast called Wine and Crime. Thank you so much, everyone. We'll talk soon.
Hey, true crime fans. Have you listened to Wine and Crime yet?
We're a true crime comedy podcast hosted by three childhood friends who chug wine, chat true crime, and unleash our worst Minnesotan accents.
Each week, us gals pick a true crime topic and pair it with a delicious wine before delving into the background and psychology behind the crime.
Then we share and speculate wildly about a couple of bonkers cases related to the topic.
Past episodes include necrophilia, cults, crimes of passion, cruise ship disappearances, exorcisms gone wrong, all this over a bottle of wine, or, let's be real, 3.
Listen anywhere you get your podcasts. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Wine and Crime Pod, and check out our website and blog at wineandcrimepodcast.com.
Cheers!